The desert stretched out like an endless black sea, its emptiness swallowing the beam of my headlights as I sped along the lonely highway. The night was pitch black, moonless, and the only sound was the low hum of my engine, a comforting constant in the desolate landscape. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling me into a sort of trance when I saw it, a beacon of light in the distance, flickering like a mirage. As I got closer, the lights resolved into something real, something solid, a truck stop. It was an old-school place, the kind you don't see much anymore, with a neon sign advertising cheap fuel and hot coffee. There was a diner, a gas station, and a few rigs parked outside, their drivers presumably inside, taking a break from the long haul. I hadn't seen a soul on the road for hours, and the thought of hot coffee and a break from the solitude was too tempting to pass up. I pulled in, the tires of my rig crunching on the gravel as I came to a stop beside the gas pumps. The place was brightly lit, almost unnaturally so, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows on the ground. As I stepped out of the cab, I noticed the stillness. The desert was always quiet, but this was different, a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I shook it off and headed toward the diner, pushing open the door with a jingle of bells. Inside, the place was a perfect replica of a 1950s diner, right down to the checkered floors and red vinyl booths. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee, their faces turned down in quiet conversation. A waitress, her hair done up in a beehive, gave me a bright, almost too bright smile as she handed me a menu. "Welcome. What can I get for you?" "Just coffee, thanks," I said, taking a seat at the counter. The other truckers glanced at me, nodding in acknowledgement before turning back to their conversations. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I sipped my coffee, strong and bitter, as I listened to the others talk. Their voices were low, almost murmurs, and I had to strain to hear them. But the more I listened, the more uneasy I became. Their stories, where they'd been, what they were hauling, were eerily similar, almost identical. Each of them spoke as if they were reading from the same script, the same vague details, the same half-remembered routes. I tried to join in, asking them how long they'd been here. One of them, a grizzled old-timer with a gray beard and tired eyes, looked at me with a confused expression. "I'm not sure," he said slowly. "Feels like I just got here, but I can't quite remember. Ain't that strange?" The others nodded, their faces blank, as if they couldn't quite grasp the concept of time. A cold dread began to creep into my chest. I checked my watch. It had stopped, the hands frozen at midnight. "I think I should get going," I said, pushing my cup away and standing up. The waitress was still smiling, that unnaturally bright smile, as she cleared my cup away. "Take care now, she said, her voice sugary sweet. I hurried back to my rig, suddenly desperate to get out of there. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I realized I hadn't paid for the gas. But something in me didn't care. I just needed to leave, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I drove back onto the highway, the darkness of the desert closing in around me once more. But as I drove, something strange happened. The road began to curve in ways it shouldn't, the turns sharper and more frequent. I should have been heading straight, but the road seemed to twist and turn of its own accord, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. After what felt like hours, I saw the lights again, the same bright, flickering lights of the truck stop. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be. There was no way I had looped back around. I had driven straight, had never turned around. But there it was, the same neon sign, the same brightly lit gas station. I sat there, staring at the truck stop, my mind racing. I couldn't go back in there. I needed to leave, to get out of this desert, but every direction I took led me right back here, to this place that shouldn't exist. With no other option, I pulled in again. The same gravel crunched under my tires. The same oppressive silence filled the air. I stepped out of the truck, my body trembling with a deep primal fear. I didn't want to go back inside, but I felt drawn to it, as if the diner itself was pulling me in. The door jingled as I entered, and the scene was exactly the same. The same truckers, sitting in the same positions, the same waitress with the same too bright smile. "Welcome back, Han," she said, as if I had never left. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No, I'm leaving," I stammered, turning on my heel and rushing back out. But when I tried to get back into my truck, the door wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, but it was as if the door was fused shut. Panic clawed at my throat, and I turned only to find the truck stop itself had changed. The bright lights had dimmed, flickering ominously, and the windows of the diner were dark, the inside obscured by shadows. I started walking, heading toward the edge of the parking lot. But the further I went, the more the truck stop seemed to stretch. The distance between me and the highway grew longer and longer, until it felt like I was walking in place. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, I was back at the entrance to the diner. The waitress stood in the doorway, her smile now a twisted, grotesque grin. "Why don't you stay a while?" she purred, her voice no longer sweet, but mocking. I stumbled backward, but the truck stop had closed in around me. The desert, the highway, everything beyond the truck stop had disappeared, replaced by an inky blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. I was trapped. The other truckers emerged from the diner, their faces blank and eyes hollow. They moved toward me in unison, like marionettes on invisible strings. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices a monotone chant. "Join us, and you'll never have to leave." I turned and ran, but no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the diner. The truckers were closer now, their expressions empty, their hands reaching out to me with an almost mechanical precision. Desperation gripped me as I realized there was no escape. The truck stop was a trap, a twisted, nightmarish web that ensnared anyone who entered, feeding on their fear, their memories, their very souls. I fell to my knees, the truckers closing in around me, their hands cold and clammy as they touched my skin. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the neon sign flickering above, the letters rearranging themselves into words that burned into my mind. "Welcome to the end of the road." When I woke up, I was sitting at the counter of the diner, a cup of coffee in front of me, its surface undisturbed. The other truckers were there, in their usual places, their faces turned down in quiet conversation. The waitress smiled at me, her eyes glittering with something dark and ancient. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't remember where I had come from, or how long I had been there. I just knew that I couldn't leave, not ever, and as I stared into the black abyss of my coffee, I realized with dawning horror that I had become one of them, trapped, just like all the others, in a place that wasn't supposed to exist, doomed to relive the nightmare for all eternity. The Appalachian Mountains have always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world and lose myself in the rhythm of the hunt. The air is crisp, the forests dense and ancient, the kind of place that feels untouched by time. I've hunted here for years, always alone, always at peace with the wilderness around me. But this time something felt different, an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. No matter how much I tried to convince myself, it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. It was late afternoon when I stumbled upon the cabin. I hadn't planned on going so deep into the woods, but the trail of a large buck had led me farther than I'd intended. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees when I saw it, a dark shape nestled among the pines, barely visible through the thickening mist. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of time. A single window stared out at me like a blind eye, its glass cracked and covered in grime. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the silent forest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the remnants of what might have once been a hunting lodge. There was a table, its surface scarred and stained, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. But what caught my eye was the rifle, propped up in the corner, half hidden in shadow. It was an old Winchester, the wood darkened with age, the barrel pitted with rust. As I picked it up, a cloud of dust puffed into the air, and I noticed that the stock was cracked, as if it had been struck with great force. It was useless, no doubt, but something about it felt wrong. The weight of it in my hands was unsettling, as if the rifle carried with it a history that was better left forgotten. On the table, beneath a layer of dust, I found a diary. The leather cover was brittle, the pages yellowed with age, but the writing inside was still legible. The name scrawled on the first page was James Harper, and the date was nearly 50 years old. As I flipped through the pages, a sense of dread settled over me, growing heavier with each entry I read. Harper had been a hunter, much like me, who had come to these mountains seeking solitude and game. But his words spoke of something else, something that had found him in the woods, a relentless stalker, something neither animal nor human, that had hunted him day and night. He wrote of hearing footsteps in the darkness, seeing shadows that moved with a mind of their own, and the stench of gunpowder that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The final entries were barely coherent, the writing shaky and desperate. Harper wrote of a figure that he had glimpsed through the trees, a man-shaped shadow with eyes that glowed like embers. He spoke of the cabin, of finding refuge here, but knowing that it wouldn't be enough. The last entry was a single sentence, scrawled across the page in a frantic hand. "It's coming for me." I set the diary down, my hands trembling slightly. The cabin was silent, but the words I'd just read seemed to echo in the stillness, filling the empty space with a growing sense of dread. Outside, the light was fading fast, the forest cloaked in shadow. I knew I should leave, find my way back to camp before darkness fell. But something kept me rooted to the spot, as if I was waiting for something. Then I heard it. Footsteps faint but unmistakable, crunching in the snow just outside the cabin. I froze, every muscle tensed, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps paused, then started again, this time closer. The sound was slow and deliberate, the stride too measured to be an animal. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my rifle, the cold metal reassuring in my grip, and edged toward the window. The glass was too grimy to see through clearly, but I could make out movement, a shadow passing between the trees. The footsteps stopped again, just beyond the door, and I held my breath, waiting. For a long moment there was only silence. Then a sharp knock echoed through the cabin, 3 hard raps that sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't answer, my mind racing. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by the creak of floorboards on the porch. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering. I knew that if I opened it, whatever was out there would be waiting for me. I had the sudden, irrational thought that this was a test, that if I stayed quiet, it might go away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to leave. The smell of gunpowder hit me then, sharp and acrid, filling my nostrils and making my eyes water. It was the same scent Harper had described, the same scent that had followed him through these woods. My stomach turned with fear, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was dealing with the same phantom that had hunted Harper 50 years ago. I knew I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that cabin, not with whatever was lurking outside, but as I moved toward the back door, I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if the thing was taking its time. Savoring the hunt, I had no choice. I had to face it. I flung the door open and stepped out into the cold night, the snow crunching under my boots. The forest was a wall of shadows, the trees looming like silent sentinels, but the tracks were there, fresh in the snow, leading away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. I followed them, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, my rifle held at the ready. The tracks were human, or close enough, large boot prints that seemed to sink too deep into the snow, as if the thing that made them was heavier than it should be. The smell of gunpowder grew stronger as I walked, the air thick with it. My head began to spin, and I forced myself to focus, to keep moving forward. The tracks led me to a small clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the snow. In the center of the clearing, the track stopped abruptly, as if the thing had simply vanished into thin air. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, my pulse racing. The forest was silent, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body gaunt and twisted, wrapped in tattered clothing that flapped in the wind. Its eyes burned with a cold red light, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It raised one hand, pointing at me, and I felt a wave of terror crash over me, freezing me in place. This was no animal, no human. This was the phantom, the thing that had hunted Harper through these woods, and now it had found me. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking, and fired. The shot rang out, shattering the silence, but the figure didn't move, didn't flinch. The bullet passed through it as if it were made of smoke, leaving nothing but the cold, empty air in its wake. It started to move then, gliding toward me with a slow, deliberate grace. Its eyes locked on mine. I stumbled back, the rifle slipping from my numb fingers, and turned to run. But the snow was deep, the trees thick, and I could feel it closing in on me, feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. The smell of gunpowder was suffocating now, burning in my throat, and I knew, with a clarity that only comes in moments of pure terror, that I wasn't going to make it. This thing, this phantom, was going to take me, just as it had taken Harper. I tripped, falling hard into the snow, and rolled onto my back, my eyes wide with fear as the figure loomed over me. It reached out, its hand hovering inches from my face, and I could see now that it wasn't a hand at all, but something twisted and wrong. Something that defied all logic and reason. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold seeped into my bones, and the world began to fade, the edges of my vision going dark. The last thing I saw was the figure's eyes, burning with that unnatural red light, and the last thing I smelled was the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. When I woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the snow. The figure was gone, the tracks leading into the clearing had vanished, and I was alone. My rifle lay beside me, the wood cracked and splintered, the barrel rusted and useless. I stumbled back to the cabin, my mind numb, my body aching with cold. The diary was still on the table, open to that final, desperate entry, and I knew that Harper's fate would soon be mine if I stayed in these woods. I left the mountains that day, abandoning my gear, my hunt, and the cabin to whatever spirits haunted it. I've never returned, and I've never spoken of what happened to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I can still smell the gunpowder, sharp and acrid, and I know that the phantom is still out there, waiting for its next victim. The road stretched endlessly before us, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. We were four friends on what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, a road trip to nowhere in particular, just to escape the grind of everyday life. We had no real destination, only the excitement of the unknown and the freedom of the open road. There was me, Ethan, the over-planner, Sarah, the skeptic, Brandon, the self-proclaimed daredevil, and Lila, quiet but sharp-eyed. We had been driving for hours, making detours whenever we spotted something interesting. But now the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the horizon. That's when we saw the village. It appeared out of nowhere, just as the light started to fade, tucked between the hills like a forgotten memory. From the highway it looked deserted, just a cluster of old, decaying buildings with faded signs and broken windows. We hadn't passed any other cars in over an hour, and none of us remembered seeing the village on the map. Brandon, of course, insisted we check it out. Come on, this is what road trips are for. Let's stretch our legs, maybe explore a bit. Who knows, we might find something cool. I should have said no. We all should have, but curiosity and the fading light made the decision for us. With a shrug, I pulled off the highway and drove down the narrow road that led toward the village. The moment we entered, a strange sensation settled over me, like a heavy blanket of silence had been thrown across the entire area. No birds, no rustling wind, just the faint creak of the car's engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. The village square was at the heart of it all, dominated by a large weathered clock tower that looked as though it hadn't told time in decades. The streets were empty, and the buildings seemed to sag under the weight of their own abandonment. "Okay, this place is creepy," Lila murmured, leaning forward in her seat. "Maybe we should keep going." Brandon grinned. "Creepy? That's what makes it fun. Look, let's get out, stretch our legs for a bit. It's probably just an old ghost town." Reluctantly, we agreed. The car doors creaked as we stepped out, our shoes echoing unnaturally loud against the cobblestone square. The village felt ancient, untouched, and yet too perfect in its dereliction, as if it were carefully preserved in decay. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, making everything seem even more distorted. Sarah walked ahead, peering through the grimy window of an old general store. "There's nothing in here, no food, no supplies. It's like the whole place just stopped." Brandon's voice broke the eerie quiet. "I'm going to check out that clock tower." He was already halfway across the square before I could say anything. Lila followed him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, glancing nervously at the buildings. Something was wrong with this place. I felt it in my gut, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe it was the way the air felt, thick, almost suffocating, or the fact that every time I turned around, I had the unsettling sensation that something had shifted, that the buildings were just a little different from the last time I looked at them. As I walked toward the others, I caught sight of movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, turning to face the alley between two of the dilapidated houses. A figure, a shadow really, stood just beyond the alley, its form barely distinguishable against the darkening sky. I blinked, and it was gone. I shivered and quickened my pace, catching up to the others. Brandon was already inside the clock tower, Sarah and Lila standing just outside the door, both of them looking as unsettled as I felt. "Something's off about this place," I said quietly, glancing over my shoulder at the square. It felt like the village itself was watching us. Sarah nodded. "I don't like it here. There's no way this place is just abandoned. It feels alive." Lila looked up at the clock tower. "Where did Brandon go?" I glanced through the doorway. The narrow staircase inside spiraled up into darkness, but there was no sign of him. "Brandon," I called, my voice echoing up the stairwell. No answer. "Brandon, this isn't funny," Lila shouted, her voice trembling slightly. Still nothing. "We should go," Sarah said firmly, stepping away from the door. "He can catch up when he's done messing around." We started back toward the car, but when we reached the square, everything had changed. The buildings weren't in the same places. The streets twisted in ways that didn't make sense, looping back on themselves. The square itself was smaller now, claustrophobic, and the clock tower seemed to loom over us, its shadow stretching far longer than it should have in the twilight. Lila gasped. "Where's the car?" It was gone. The spot where we had parked was empty. No sign of our vehicle, no tracks in the gravel. Just more cobblestones and more buildings that seemed to shift whenever we looked away. "We're stuck here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She was right. No matter where we turned, no matter how far we walked, we always ended up back in the square, facing the clock tower. The sky had grown darker, the stars hidden behind thick, unnatural clouds that seemed to press down on us, trapping us in this place. "I saw something," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. "In the alley. I think there's something here, watching us." Sarah's face went pale. "We need to find Brandon and get out, now." But it wasn't that simple. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as we wandered the streets, calling out for Brandon, but the village twisted and shifted around us, the buildings rearranging themselves in impossible ways. We were being toyed with, manipulated, but by what? The shadows moved unnaturally, slithering at the edge of our vision, always just out of sight. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the clock tower again, exhausted and terrified. And that's when we saw him, Brandon, standing at the base of the tower, his back to us. "Brandon," Lila cried, rushing forward. But as she reached him, she stopped dead, her body shaking. I ran up behind her, my stomach dropping as I looked at him. It wasn't Brandon. The thing wearing his clothes stood rigid, its face, Brandon's face, twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. His eyes, once bright, were now dark, hollow, as if something had scooped out everything that had made him human. His head tilted unnaturally to one side, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled, and then he spoke. But it wasn't his voice. "You shouldn't have come here," the thing that looked like Brandon said, its voice a guttural rasp. "This village is not for the living." We stumbled back, horrified, but the thing took a step toward us, its body jerking in unnatural movements, like it wasn't used to walking. "You're part of it now," it hissed. "You can't leave." The shadows around us began to move, converging on the square, taking shape, figures, all twisted and wrong, their faces frozen in expressions of torment. They moved toward us, slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Lila and pulling her away from the square. Sarah followed close behind, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter which direction we took, we always ended up back at the clock tower. And each time there were more of them, the figures, the shadows, creeping closer and closer. Their empty eyes fixed on us. Lila fell to her knees, sobbing. "We're never getting out of here." I looked around, desperate, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. The village had a history, a dark secret, something that was keeping us trapped here. But what? That's when I saw it, carved into the base of the clock tower, hidden beneath layers of grime and age. A name. A single name scratched into the stone as if by a dying hand. Ilara. Suddenly it all clicked. The shifting village, the trapped souls, the twisted figures. This place wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, and we were the latest to be caught in its web. "Ilara," I whispered, standing up. "It's her. She's the one keeping us here." But before I could say more, the figures closed in, their hands reaching out for us, pulling us into the darkness. And as their cold fingers wrapped around me, I realized something horrible. We weren't the first, and we wouldn't be the last.